As a filmmaker, it's awesome when you finally graduate from using mirrorless cameras for video to dedicated cinema cameras, until you realize that the mirrorless cameras have some functions that you really love and that the cinema cameras are lacking. And you wonder, how is it possible that the more expensive, and often way more expensive cameras don't have the functionality that these mirrorless cameras do? So today, we're gonna go through the 5 functionalities that these mirrorless cameras have for video that cinema cameras often lack, and beg the developers at Canon, Sony, Panasonic, and all the others to please include these functions in your next cinema camera release. So we have 2 mirrorless cameras here, 2 of my favorites. This is the Fujifilm X-T4, which you can find for less than $1,000 now. And then this mirrorless camera here is probably the most feature-packed mirrorless video camera ever released. The Panasonic S1H from Lumix is really one of the original mirrorless cameras that started packing in all the amazing features that cinema cameras had. All right, number 1, the electronic level. So this seems so simple. An electronic level is basically a little level that comes up on your screen that shows whether your shot is level or not. And for many shoots, that's very important. So unless you're trying to do a Dutch angle, you generally want your shots to be level, whether you're on a tripod or especially when you're hand holding it on a monopod or an easy rig. Having just a little indicator that tells you whether you're shooting crooked or not is incredibly important. And still to this day, I don't understand how when it launched, $10,000 or $11,000 C300 Mark III or the $5,000 C70 does not have this function when cameras like the Fuji X-T4 and pretty much every mirrorless camera in the last 6 years have had this function. On something like the S1H, all you gotta do is push a button and boom, a big electronic level comes up on the screen and you can see pretty easily whether you're actually level or not. And so once that little line turns green, you're good to go. One other camera that does have the electronic level that is somewhere close to a cinema camera is the Canon R5C, though it definitely functions more in the hybrid realm than I think it does in the cinema camera realm. But it has probably the best functionality for a level I've ever seen. The only problem with the S1H and something like the X-T4 is their level is just a little too big and blocks too much of your view. So the Canon R5C has one of the best implementations, and I hope that every manufacturer puts that in their next release. Electronic level, please, Canon, Sony, Panasonic, in your cinema camera. It's not that hard. I don't want to keep putting little bubbles all over my cameras. It's silly. All right, number 2, custom dial modes. So most mirrorless cameras and DSLRs before them have a little, what's called a PSAM dial, which stands for the letters on the dial. You push the dial in and you can just cycle through the different settings on your camera very quickly. And the ones that are important for this are these custom mode dials, which is C1, C2, C3. And what's beautiful about these on mirrorless cameras is it allows you to change your settings in your camera instantaneously with just a flip of the dial. So for example, on the S1H, I often put my C1 as my standard recording mode. For me, it's downsampled 6K to 4K 10-bit 422, and every time I go to C1, I know that that is exactly what my settings are. But if you're shooting a fast-paced thing like sports or a commercial and you just want to quickly get a slow motion shot, then you can just quickly push it in and boom, go to C2, and bam, now you're in slow motion where all your other settings stay the same. And then if you have a camera that has further functionality like 120 frames per second, then you can just quickly hit to C3 and boom, you're in a different mode altogether, whether it's slow motion or anamorphic mode, whatever it is that you are wanting to shoot and do it quickly. This could be easily implemented on a camera like the C300. It's got plenty of space on the body. Most cinema cameras have a functionality where you can put an S&Q mode or program a button so that you can actually go quickly from your normal record modes to your slow motion. The problem with this, for a C70 recording 120 frames per second, you have to go into long GOP mode first and then change it to 120 frames per second. And that takes quite a few steps if your normal record mode is in intra frame. Whereas on mirrorless cameras, it's just a quick flip of the switch. Boom, 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 boom. Please, custom modes on the body, please. Functionality number 3, usable EVFs. Now, when a new mirrorless camera is announced, one of the first things reviewers want to check out and see is whether the EVF on the back is big enough and bright enough for critical focus and in bright days and all the different things that people use EVFs for. So when I'm shooting documentaries or commercials, I don't always love using the EVF. I like to be able to see what's around me, and closing one eye and stick another eye into just the prism that you are seeing feels a little limiting to me, almost a little claustrophobic. But in certain situations, situations when it's really bright outside and maybe you can't quite see your screen, having a usable EVF can be an absolute game changer and maybe the only way you can be sure that you're hitting critical focus. The EVF on this camera, the Panasonic S1H, is big, it's beautiful, and it's easy to see what you're focusing on when you're actually inside the viewfinder. Cameras like the C70 and the C300 don't even come with an EVF, which I'm not super sad about. It's not a huge deal. But the C300 EVF that you can buy as a separate attachment goes on in a very awkward place on the back of a very heavy camera, and honestly is just not very good and not very usable. And so please, in your next release, offer some sort of usable EVF or loop that you can connect to your monitor so you can actually see what you're doing. So a pretty incredible functionality that mirrorless cameras have that most cinema cameras do not is open gate recording. Despite the fancy title of open gate recording, all it's really doing is recording the entire sensor. So in the S1H and X-T4 and most photo cameras, you're looking at a sensor that's 3x2, so 36 by 24 millimeters for a full frame like the S1H. And what it's doing when you're recording open gate is recording the whole sensor as if you were taking a photo, right? Your photos come out with a full sensor, but when you crop to video, it often crops off the top and the bottom to become 16:9. Open gate allows you to record the entire sensor, so you record in the 3x2 aspect ratio. And this is important because even if you don't want to finish your film in 3x2, it gives you a lot of different possibilities in the editing suite, right? So now so much of our videos are also edited for social, so be able to shoot in a more 3x2 square aspect ratio gives you much more croppability on the top and the bottom for things like social on iPhones, but it also gives you a little bit of leeway for cropping on the regular 16:9. You just have more information and more real estate to actually work with for framing and for final output. Also really important these days with open gate recording is anamorphics. So anamorphic lenses have become very popular in the last few years thanks to amazing companies like Laowa and DZO putting out more affordable anamorphics. The issue with anamorphics is they de-squeeze your image into a wider aspect ratio. So if you have a 1.5x D-squeeze or a 2x D-squeeze and you're on a 16:9 sensor, that's going to be just a sliver of an aspect ratio once you actually get it into your editing software and output it for the world to see. But by shooting in a open gate 3x2 or 4x3, that becomes a more usable either 2.39:1 or perhaps even closer to a 2:1 on a 1.5 squeeze. You can actually upload that to the internet for people to actually watch, and it's not just a sliver. And again, the FX6, the FX9, the C300, the C70, none of these cameras actually have open gate recording and you're stuck with 16:9 or 17:9. Even the Sony Burano, a $25,000 8.6K camera, is limited to 16:9, even though it's using a full frame 3x2 sensor. If you're spending $25,000 on a camera, you should be able to use the full sensor that's in the camera itself. So please add open gate recording to your next cinema camera release, because these mirrorless cameras do, like the S1H, the S5 II, the S5 IIX, and so many others. So last and definitely not least, and probably my biggest ask, is the #1 mirrorless camera function that is not in very many cinema cameras, just one as of now, and that is IBIS. And I'll probably get a lot of hate for this because a lot of people, especially in the forums, but even the professional realm, don't want IBIS in their cameras because sometimes it can be a little unpredictable. There are definitely moments when you're working with a camera with IBIS where you get a little bit of extra wobble or some little jump that you just don't want in your footage. And so it's better just not to have it at all. But what IBIS gives you is the freedom to create smooth and beautiful images with everything from a wide angle to zooms to vintage primes, like right here, the Contax 50, is that suddenly I can use this camera with a Contax 50mm Zeiss lens and it is stabilized. And there's just no other way to do that other than using internal stabilization, unless you want to use a tripod or rig this thing out so that it's so heavy that it stabilizes a little bit better. For independent filmmakers and especially documentary filmmakers, IBIS is incredibly useful because it allows you to use something like a zoom that doesn't have internal stabilization and stabilize it with the body itself. So the only cinema camera that has a stabilized sensor now is the Sony Burano. I saw the Sony Burano and tested it out at the Camera Image Film Festival in Poland just a couple months ago, and I was amazed when I put on a 100mm ARRI Master Prime and saw how stable the footage was. It was truly incredible and truly opened up a whole new world of handheld shooting, especially for documentary filmmakers. I would love to see in future implementations of the C300, C500, C70, Sony FX6, all the different manufacturers to put IBIS into their cameras because it is an absolute game changer for documentary filmmakers specifically, but really for any independent or small crew filmmaker. So there we go. 5 functionalities that mirrorless cameras have that cinema cameras do not. We're talking IBIS, EVF, custom modes, electronic level, and open gate recording. And I think cinema cameras would do very well to put these into their next release. So what do you think? What types of functionalities do you have in mirrorless cameras or in cinema cameras that you want in every single one of your cameras moving forward? Let me know in the comments below, and hopefully all the reps from all the manufacturers will see the flood of comments that we're going to demand awesome functionality that are in these cameras in our more expensive cinema cameras. We'll see you in the next one.